So I'm not going to read through my entire title again. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, so, all right. Outside, right now, somewhere in North America, every 15 seconds, somebody has had a head injury. Okay? Over time, if it's by chance, the majority of them are mild traumatic brain injury, right? 80 to 90% of them. And usually they subside in terms of their symptoms, which can be mood, cognitive, or physical within 30 days. That's what the research shows us. However, some persist. They have persistent symptoms that go well beyond this period, up to 90 days, which some have termed the post-acute period. Now, some of those patients may see different clinicians. And again, I kind of alluded to earlier, if they have persistent symptoms that preclude them from going back to work, school, play, they may see a neuropsychologist. The neuropsychologist is usually tasked with the question of, well, can this person go back to school, work, play, to what capacity, and what kinds of resources would they need? And again, like I said before, some of the tools that we have developed in neuropsychology were not necessarily meant to answer these questions directly. So if you look back at the history of neuropsychology within this realm of mild traumatic brain injury or head injuries in general, you would see that initially neuropsychology was developed, and the tests that we have developed helped answer the site and size of the lesion to help the neurosurgeon tackle whatever infarct may be. And then things shifted when neuroimaging became more relevant and in the clinics. And then the referral question shifted from site and size towards, well, what are the strengths and weaknesses that this person has in terms of their cognitive domains, right? Or are there limitations to their cognition? Then again, within those who are seeing head-injured patients, the referral question shifted once again. And this is mostly due to insurance-based assessments and insurer-paid, whoever really is a payer for those benefits. They're asking not necessarily about the strengths or weaknesses, but rather, can this person go back to school, work, play, etc.? The problem with all this is that although the question has shifted, the tests that we use have been largely the same, right? We just sort of shifted the rules and said, okay, well now the way that they are actually performing on these particular tests, well, we can estimate how they can perform in their real life. But I say we should go back to the basics and maybe develop a new test, because if I were to give you a map and ask you to find Toronto on that map, you probably could do that. But then if I switch the question and say, tell me the GDP of Toronto, you can't use the same tool. You have to use a new tool to answer that question. And so this is the mindset that I use, at least going towards and developing a new tool. And so the whole idea is that we need to be more ecologically valid. And by ecological validity, we just mean that our test measures should be reflective of the types of behaviors that we're trying to estimate in the real world, right? So I had a picture of the trail making test. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with that. You have to connect dots from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, in a speeded fashion as quickly as you can. It's a test of psychomotor speed, attention, those kinds of domains. How does that relate to somebody's ability to go back to working at wherever they work at, right? If I were to, and that's largely the types of tests that we use within traditional tests in clinical neuropsychology. Here's another one called the block design. And this is an approach that we use called the veridicality approach. This is basically taking a test that has low face validity towards the behavior that we're trying to estimate, but we have potentially some statistical significance or correlation towards that outcome. And there's some evidence for this in other types of brain injuries, ABIs, etc. But I'll show you that in mild traumatic brain injury, especially in the post-acute periods, there's very little to no evidence. The other approach that we can also use is called the verisimilitude, or I like to say it's very similar to the actual test or behavior we're trying to approach. That's my one joke, I promise. And so in this case, if I were to be tasked with determining if you can go back to your office job of writing reports all day long, maybe I might give you a typing task, right? Maybe I might give you a task where you go in front of a screen and can tolerate it or not. It's reflective on face value. So this is that spectrum that I alluded to earlier, right? I already went ahead and tried to test the traditional measures. We found that they're not necessarily reflective of real-world abilities. They can't predict whether or not someone has returned to work or not within the patient population of mild traumatic brain injury. And then we also did the research on ecologically oriented tests. So earlier, my previous talk was on that. And again, there's some evidence only when looking at the effect sizes, right? There was some limited evidence of that. The other way along the spectrum was naturalistic assessments, which can be really great. You actually test them in hospitals. You test them in let's say shopping malls, etc. The only problem is psychologists won't like this test or this type of approach because it's not psychometrically rigorous. We can't control it from site to site. And so you have to build your own particular naturalistic assessment at Baycrest, for example, which they have done. The next one is also combining everything, the psychometric rigor the psychologists love, along with being able to replicate the real-world environment. So this is the approach that I took, which was to develop brand new virtual reality measures to be able to determine whether or not someone can return to work or not. So that's basically the objective that we did. And we also not only just want to develop this particular task or these tasks, but we want to pin them against the ecologically valid ones, the ones that I showed you before, the BADS, in addition to another test called the test of everyday attention. Same idea, but now more attention-focused, in addition to other traditional neuropsychological measures. So we reasoned that virtual reality tests may be more ecologically valid based on the face validity and the very similitude approach that we mentioned earlier. And of course, the findings from the BAD study. So this was a cross-sectional design. We used discriminant functions analysis to be able to determine whether or not someone had returned to work or not. This was on an interval scale, on a nominal scale. And the predictors were all the different tests that we employed, which I'll show you in a second, in addition to the virtual reality tests. We had 50 participants in total, and of these 50 patients, 23 had returned to work, 27 had not. Once again, no differences between the different demographic data here, and similar inclusion criteria as before, as I showed you. They have the important one, which is they have actually passed all symptom validity and performance validity tests. So I'm not going to bore you with the number of tests that we use, especially, I think there's only a few neuropsychologists in the room, but we love our tests. And just to show you a simplistic view, there were different domains of tests that we use, so broadly executive functioning and attention. There are different subcomponents that each of these tests measure, and so we try to match them with their traditional ecologically valid measure, also with the virtual reality tests that we developed. Let me talk to you about the virtual reality tests that we made. So one was an office task, or at least that's what we called it. The whole idea was that you are a delivery person, let's say you work for Amazon, and you're delivering different packages that are poorly labeled to different doors. Now, you have to use deductive reasoning to be able to understand where that package should be delivered to. And the only feedback you're going to receive is correct or incorrect. And there are a number of trials. It's untimed, so they can take as long as they want to actually complete this task. Similarly, we created an attention task, which, let's say you work at Amazon again, you would be able to be in charge of determining whether or not a box was ready to be delivered or sent back for checking, quality assurance, etc. We call this a conveyor belt task, and there are 4 subcomponents of selective attention, sustained attention, divided attention, and attention shift. Here we manipulated the speed and difficulty levels based on how fast the stimuli were presented, along with the decrease in the interstimulus interval and reducing the target stimulus from being a very large target to being a very small target visually. Okay, so in our results, what we found is that after all those predictors, only 2 of the predictors were significant in the final model. One was the virtual reality test of attention shift, along with the traditional test, which was a rough 2-7 total speed. For those of you who are not familiar, it's a cancellation test. There's several lines of letters and numbers. Your job is to cancel out all 2s and 7s as quickly as you can, going left to right in a timed period. So only those 2 tests were predictive. And from the discriminant functions analysis classification results, we found that the model actually predicted those who were employed up to 87%, and those who were unemployed 77.8% of time accurately. The total accuracy was at 82%, and the sensitivity and specificity were similar as well. This was confirmed with a split half cross follow-up analysis. Now, if we were to take a look at the actual effect sizes, we find that the virtual reality test of attention shift and another similar virtual reality test of divided attention, they're very similar. If I can just go back and show you real quick, and I'll come back to this. It's these 2 right here. We have divided attention and attention shift. You're in charge of both conveyor belts at the same time. The only difference here is that you have a distractor, a broken arrow, which you're not supposed to pay attention to. And this one had the highest effect sizes across all the tests. So going back and looking at the effect sizes, what we noticed was that the attention shift divided attention tasks had the highest effect sizes, along with the verticality or the verisimilitude, so traditional or the BADS, the TA tests, were very similar in their effect sizes. So what we concluded too was that virtual reality tests, the ones we developed here at least, were, according to the effect sizes, greater or more ecologically valid than the verisimilitude or verticality, which are more or less equal here. Now, of course, just to step back again, my key findings were that the virtual reality tests of attention shift and the REF27 were the most predictive of return to work in this population and in this sample. We found that the virtual reality executive task, so that office task that I showed you, was not predictive at all. In fact, none of the executive measures were predictive of return to work in our population. And this provides some preliminary evidence of this particular type of VR test within a clinical setting, specifically for return to work functional outcome. Now, there's a number of limitations. Just because we found this doesn't mean it's going to be the new gold clinical standard. It has to be replicated in different patient populations. In addition, we have to also increase sample sizes, and we need to use different types of samples, not just litigating, because we know that litigating patients have poor recovery. However, this is the bread and butter of most post-acute period patients that neuropsychologists see. We had very small sample sizes, and we were not able to stratify between different types or levels of return to work or work, so high cognitive load versus low cognitive load employment, or if they went full-time, part-time, modified duties, etc. And we didn't account for mood in these settings. However, we did employ the PAI to determine whether or not someone was excluded based on depression, anxiety, or other clinically diagnosed mood disorders. Our future directions really quickly are, let's try other tests of attention, maybe ones with response inhibition. For example, the PACEAT, which is you have to add different numbers in your head at a speeded pace. SART, which is a selective attention response test. Maybe even corroborating it with different types of fMRI types of investigations to determine any sort of causal links. Lastly, what we did right here was that we actually tested from the post-acute period to determine their current return to work status. It'd be more beneficial, I think, for future studies to be able to test at the acute period to see what happens in the post-acute period of return to work, right? Lastly, it'd be interesting to explore other types of virtual reality paradigms. This is the OmniTread. You're able to walk and feel as if you're walking through different environments, so get that visceral response. Thank you.
That's okay. Thanks, Eliyas. Time for a quick question. Okay, go ahead. That's okay. Can you talk loudly?
Yes, we use goggles for virtual reality, right?
We initially used a head-mounted display. We actually had to stop using that because of initially it had sickness, and then the revolution came with Oculus. So.
Okay, yeah, so that's interesting. A very interesting idea to use virtual reality. My question was actually that, because with virtual reality and using goggles, lots of vestibular symptoms, even in patients who don't have concussions. So I was wondering if you had any side effects or any patients.
Yeah. So in our initial piloting, we definitely found that, but this is before the days of Oculus. And the reason why I bring Oculus around is because they started using USB 3.0, which means basically lower lag latency between the actual stimulus and what the computer can process. So which means that you don't have that Coriolis effect where you're on the ship and you're seeing like the distance. Yeah. So we've actually had less amount of vestibular problems, even in patients, using the Oculus. However, we had already started collecting data on the non-immersive 2D screen version, so we continue with that.